Greetings to you here this resurrection weekend in the year 2020. We're going to look at a text where Paul summarizes what the core of the gospel is. But before we do that, let me just say a word of personal concern and a word of personal greeting to you. Many of us now have been confined to our homes because of the coronavirus outbreak, the pandemic, and others of us have even more dire concern for family members or friends who are sick or who have died, for those who left behind who are grieving. And I pray that the Lord would comfort you and strengthen you through whatever trial you're going through with us right now. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 4. The Apostle Paul here, writing to the Corinthian congregation, he says, Paredoka garhumin in protois. In other words, he says, for I handed over, I gave on to you all, right? This is the language of handing on tradition. For I handed on to you all. That paradoka is, of course, an aorist active indicative, first person singular from the verb paradidomi, right? Paradidomi. For I handed on to you all in the first things, or among the first things, among the things of first importance, right? Which also I received. And that's a little bit of an interesting language for the Apostle Paul, isn't it? If you compare that with Galatians chapter 1 and 2, he's very emphatic that his apostleship comes directly from Christ appearing to him on the Damascus road. But he also says in Galatians that the apostles gave him the right hand of fellowship. And that right hand of fellowship was centered around the same gospel, that they preached and proclaimed the same gospel. And so now Paul is passing on this tradition, this sort of liturgical confession, which he says he received, paralambano, right? Which in no way in receiving this does it diminish the way that Christ appeared directly to him and commissioned him as an apostle. But he's passing on this tradition, this core tradition, inspired core tradition, about what the gospel is, right? This is from paralambano. You can see it's a second aorist active indicative. That's a first person singular, which also I received. Here it is, right here. So what is it, Paul? What's the gospel? What's the most important thing? Christ died, right? Christians are sometimes accused of being obsessed with the death of Jesus. Well, we rightly are obsessed with the death, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, because it's only by Jesus dying for our sins that we were reconciled to God, right? Christ died for our sins. And you have to have the bad news that we are sinners before you get the good news that we're forgiven through Christ, right? We are rebels against God. And that's why Christ had to die. He had to die for our sins. And this was all, Paul tells us, according to the Scriptures, right? God laid out the plan about how he was going to send the Messiah, and how the Messiah, the suffering servant, Isaiah 53, would reconcile an estranged and rebellious people to God. And so we find the fulfillment. All of this is done in accord with the Scriptures. So we have here, we said Christ died. Then we read, and that he was buried, right? That's the aorist passive of thopto. He was buried. And that he was raised, or perhaps he has been raised, right? He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. That's striking, isn't it? That repetition again, according to the Scriptures, according to the Scriptures. This is all according to God's redemptive plan laid out in the Scriptures. Notice those three verbs. Did you notice that? Right? He died, aorist, right? Just highlight that in green here. He died. He was buried, aorist, right? Just reporting that it happened, perfective aspect, looking at it as a whole. This happened, he died, he was buried, he was raised. But notice, even though we're translating that the same way, see that ending, tai, see the change on the beginning? This is from the verb egero, to raise or to raise up. This is a perfect, passive, indicative, third person singular. Most students learn to translate the perfect, as always, with has or have. That does not always work in English, but it is significant to note that this is a perfect, right? Because the normal meaning of the perfect is not just reporting that an event happened in the past, right? Because it is asserting, right, in history and space and time, Christ was raised, right? His body was raised from the dead, right? That's true. But there's an ongoing state, right, that has resulted from this. Most naturally, the perfect conveys an idea of an ongoing state and or an ongoing relevance. I think both of those really overlap here, right? Christ was raised and he lives, right? He's in a state of being one who's raised. He lives, and that's very relevant for us as believers because his life, he stands before the throne of the Father, his wounds ever showing that atonement has been made, his glorified wounds as evidence for the sufficiency and efficacy of his atoning death, right? He lives, he ever lives to make intercession for us, right? Christ died, he was buried, he's raised and he lives forevermore.